Hey, it's the 40-watt garage. Welcome to the channel, or welcome back. Today's installment is going to be diagnosing and repairing a problem with my Factory 5 Mark IV Roadster. It's almost end of driving season where I live, and I was attempting to go and fill up the car for the last time and tuck it away for the winter. And I put a dose of fuel stabilizer in the tank and went out for a drive to get things warmed up, and then gonna stop at the station and fill up and bring it back and put it away. But on my short 10 or so mile drive around to get things heated up, I started smelling brakes, that smell that draggy brakes make. And I didn't think much about it. And then I put the clutch in to slow down for a turn, and the car just really decelerated. It didn't coast. It was like I was applying the brakes, but I did not have the brakes on. And so I drove a little bit further, and the car was lugging. It didn't feel right, and I'm still smelling that brake smell, and it's like, okay, abort the mission, get it back home. Got it home, got it up on the lift, and both front wheels were hot. I could barely touch the hubs with my hand. I got out my infrared thermometer, and the front brakes were over 300 degrees. And I could barely turn the wheels, grabbing the wheel and giving it a twist. It would not free spin, so the brakes were definitely dragging. When I built the car, I decided to use the Mustang or the Ford brake calipers, front and rear. And then I bought, or came with the kit, the Wilwood brake pedal assembly with their master cylinders. And it's kind of a known problem that the Mustang or PBR front calipers have a history of sticking. I guess they have phenolic plastic pistons, and either over time or lack of use, those pistons, they swell, or the seals swell, and those calipers can stick. So that's what first occurred to me, but I had a simultaneous failure on both sides of the front brake system, which really can't come down to a caliper problem. For two components to similarly fail at the exact same time with the same symptoms, it doesn't make sense. So that pointed me back towards I may have a master cylinder problem. And one of the things that can cause brakes to drag using the Wilwood master cylinders is that if your brake pedal or your linkage is not retracting or allowing the piston in the master cylinder to fully retract, which blocks the return port, which would hold pressure on the front brakes. So I got it back, got it up in the air, and I kind of confirmed it by raising both front wheels off the lift, and then I let it sit overnight. The next morning, it was at room temperature, 70 degrees, and I was able to get over to the car, grab the wheel, give it a good shove, and both front wheels spun 3 or more rotations freely, and then just a very light scuffing sound from the brakes. So the brake calipers are not seized up. So I'm thinking that there's something wrong with the front master cylinder that is not allowing the residual pressure to relieve, and the front brakes are dragging. So I'm gonna tear into this a little bit, take a look, and further diagnosis. So stay tuned. Well, I removed my access cover for the foot box, and that gives you access into where the brake master cylinders are mounted. And when I lifted the cover off, I looked inside and I did not like what I saw. If you look down below that push rod and below the rubber bellows, you see how all of the paint is wrinkled up and degraded. And then I've got some kind of a science project growing there on the mounting surface of the master cylinder here. This kind of crumbly stuff. Well, the only reason for that paint to be bubbling off like that is that I have a brake fluid leak from somewhere. And I look back in at my fitting attachment. I don't know if that'll show up or not, but it is not dripping in the rear where my brake line attaches. So I am suspecting that there's a leak in the master cylinder. And if I can pop this boot, this dust boot off of the master, take a look inside. Oh yeah, that is not good. See if I can get the camera to see. It's wet. Inside the master cylinder boot, I have rust, brake fluid. So I definitely have a leaking master cylinder. So something either got into the bore of the master and blew out that seal, or there's a piece of crud in there that's blocking the return port. I am going to have to dig into this a little more and figure out what is going on. And I think the biggest puzzle of this is going to be either working from below in the footwell and from above out here through this little access hatch on how to remove that master cylinder. Stay tuned. Okay, upon further inspection and looking around, I got that dust boot completely off of the master cylinder here, and you can see the fluid and the gunk inside of it. So the master has definitely blown a seal or has been leaking out the front. But then also, by reaching in, hopefully this will come through, my brake pedal is fully up against the stop, and I do have just a touch, maybe you can even hear it and you can see it, just a touch of free play between this push rod, the push rod here, and where it registers into the piston. So I know that the piston in the master cylinder is not being prevented from fully retracting back, so it is not being held in the applied position. So where this is going from here is I'm going to need to drain my reservoir for the front master cylinder, and I believe I should be able to drop this master cylinder either out through the foot box or up and out through the top. It depends on how much clearance I've got, what might be easier to do. So in preparation for draining the reservoir, I've laid down some old bath towels on the floor because I know that some fluid is going to escape and drip down. Don't want it getting into the carpet. So I'm going to rig up something to drain the fluid out of the reservoir. Well, I don't know how well you're going to be able to see, but what I've got to do is release that clamp down here on my reservoir feed hose, and then try to not spill a ton of fluid in. And then I have re-rigged my brake bleeding vacuum pump, and I'm going to use that to suck the fluid out of the reservoir. So this ought to be interesting. Wish me luck. But if I can get in there. Okay, got the clamp released. Now if I can get this hose off without it snapping and spraying fluid all over. Got lucky. Get it on the end. And look at that. There we go. It's nearly full already. I'm going to go empty this and we'll be back for round 2. All right, well that appears to be the end of the fluid. So I'll get something to plug the end of this hose with, and then we will continue. Well, that wasn't too terrible to get the fluid drained out, and I've got the line plugged with a bolt and put the clamp back on. Now the next fun part is going to be loosening that flare nut on the output of the master cylinder. There's very little clearance in there. I don't know if I'm going to have to get it from above here or down below in the footwell. We're going to try. But I can give you this one bit of advice, that whenever you're working with tubing or line fittings, if you can, always use a flare nut wrench to avoid rounding off the fitting. So I'm gonna probably dig around into this, utter a few choice cuss words, and try to crack that fitting loose. One other thing I do have at the ready is I've got a rubber cap, so that when I get that fitting loose and loosen it from the master cylinder, I don't want it to drip fluid out or drain out the line, or I want it to as little as possible. So as soon as I get that loose and free, we'll pop the rubber cap over the end of the line to try to preserve the fluid in the lines. Well, you can see I got the line loose from the output of the master cylinder. I used the flare nut wrench to crack it loose, but then with that only being a 6-point, of course it wouldn't line up to give me any swing. So combination of the flare nut wrench and then a standard 3/8 wrench, and I was able to crack it loose and then use my fingers to remove it. I changed to a different rubber cap. I wasn't able to push that first one over the end of the line, so found a different one. So it is disconnected, capped. I'm gonna go after the retaining nuts for the master cylinder and then probably drop it out through the bottom. So we'll get this thing unbolted and see you over on the workbench. This was a memory lapse on my part from when I assembled the car till now. And I'm just thinking back to my previous experience with master cylinders, and usually the push rod that goes into the master is just a rounded end rod that fits into a corresponding socket in the master cylinder. But on this particular case, the push rod is attached to the master cylinder, so I have to relieve it from the clevis here. So what I've done is taken a 1/4 inch wrench on the flats on the push rod, broken loose the lock nut, and now what's important, so I get it back in the same position again, or very close to the same position, is I have to count how many turns it takes to remove the push rod from the clevis. So I'm just going to remove this, count half turns until it's released. Well, in my particular instance, it was 11 1/2 turns to release the push rod from the clevis. So now I can get rid of this nut. And hopefully wiggle this master cylinder up and out of here. Look at that, you can do it one-handed. And it's out. Well, now you can see the carnage underneath where that front master cylinder bolts down, and all of the wetness and the gunk and the leaky fluid. I'm sure some of that fluid is from me taking it out, but I'm guessing most of that came from when I pried loose the dust boot, and what had blown past the seals poured out of the rubber dust boot. So I had a impending total failure happening, so I'm kind of glad that this happened now while I was able to get a hold of it. So we'll see what results when I take the master cylinder apart. Another thing to remember when you're doing this kind of repair is you're going to get brake fluid on your hands and on your fingers, and avoid touching any of your paint or your body work. Have a rag handy at all times, and then look and make sure that you didn't inadvertently touch something, because brake fluid will chew the paint right off after a while, so don't cause yourself a further headache.